So my name's Amy Trubek, and I wrote the book. So I'll talk to you about that. Just if people could just share their names, that'd be great.
I'm Susan. Lily.
Lily?
I'm Bob.
Marita. Lori.
And
I'm Angela. Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late, Amy.
that's okay. We just started. So I did not prepare formal remarks because I just figured it was going to be a nice small group of people in my community, and I thought it would be more fun to sort of have a conversation than to kind of be professorial. I will say for the record, I am a professor. I teach at the University of Vermont. So I have been doing it for long enough that I have that Charlie Brown teacher problem, like, wah, 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 wah. So I always think I'm barely talking, and then I'm like, oh, 10 minutes went by. So I don't know. So, just raise your hands or whatever, or be like, okay, enough. We want to talk whenever you want. So I thought what I would do is tell you a little bit of background about why I wrote this book and how I did it, and create a little bit of context for what the book says. And then I was going to read a couple little sections of it. And then what I really wanted to do was have a conversation, because it's a book about making meals in the United States, and we all have a lot of experience with that. So we all have lots of ways we can share stories. And it's also, the book is also trying to talk about how things have changed over the last 75 years and speculates a little bit about maybe what is the future going to look like. So anything people want to talk about would be great. So
Would you give us the title of the book, please?
It's called Making Modern Meals, How Americans Cook Today.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So, just in terms of a little bit of background, I have been involved in the sort of world of food and for my whole adult life. And before that, obviously, too, because I had to be fed. But starting in high school, I worked in restaurants, and I had a little catering business with a friend of mine. And throughout college, I worked in restaurants, and then I worked in restaurants, and I went to culinary school. But I also was very interested in sort of the cultural aspects of food, so I ended up getting a PhD in anthropology, and I also continued to study food and cooking. It's really what I do. So my entire adult life, I've been primarily interested in getting people to pay attention to cooking. I think cooking is absolutely one of the most fascinating aspects of human experience that has been incredibly neglected from the point of view of scholarship. That's one thing. It also has tended to be either dismissed as women's work or overly kind of frou-frou as a kind of thing that is done, that's some kind of elitist kind of thing that fancy people do. And in fact, it's a much, much more rich and complicated practice than something that we should ignore or say that it's silly to sort of spend too much time trying to put the rosemary just exactly right on the mashed potatoes. I actually think there's something to be said for that. So all of my research has tended to focus on ways in which we understand cooking or making food or drink as a kind of practice. So I'm really particularly interested in the practice of it. So I have written about the history of the culinary profession, so professional cooking. I've written about regional cuisine, and then this book is about domestic cooking. So there's actually kind of a red thread through it all for me personally. And one of the nice things about it is those were the three things I wanted to do, and I did it, so now I feel like I'm done, and I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I'll study Arctic whale hunting. I don't know. Like, I really have no idea what's going to come up next, which is kind of fun for me. But
Can you really be done with this topic? Revisit it?
I know No, but now it's gotten so popular. Like since I started doing it, like now there's a mazillion books. Like when I was getting my PhD, no joke, when I finished my PhD, I'd read every single scholarly work that had been done on food and cooking. Like, because there were 10. I wasn't that good of a student. There weren't that many. And now there's like 100 million books on food, and everybody's writing about it and talking about it. So I'm sort of like, I don't know. We'll see what happens. But anyway, one of the reasons I got interested in writing the book, I always wanted to write about domestic cooking, but the way I wrote about domestic cooking in this book is related. I'm very much motivated by the way in which a culture has a conversation with itself about what's going on. And one of the things that started happening in the United States about cooking about 20 years ago was that it was in decline. It was going down, 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 down. And there was all of these possible dire consequences about the decline of cooking. And there's nothing I like better than a conspiracy theory or a theory of decline, because I'm always like, really? Are we sure? Do we really want to say that? So that was a lot of what started me. Was I wanted to understand, was there in fact a decline in cooking skill and knowledge among everyday home cooks? Of course, because I do scholarly work, of course, what do you think that my answer is, oh, it's really complicated. Which is really boring, I know, but it is complicated. But I would like to say, for the record, that I will go out and say it's not in decline. It's shifted, and it's been transformed. But there's a lot of people who know a lot about cooking, but the people who know a lot about cooking today are not necessarily the people who were expected to know a lot about cooking 75 years ago, which was women. So there's just a lot of really interesting things going on. So, but this is the macro level trend that is driving a lot of this cultural discourse about decline. And the cultural trend is we've gone from spending in 1963 almost 80% of the food expenditures on food that we buy whole ingredients and prepare at home to 50, and we've had an exactly equivalent rise in food prepared away from the home. So there has been there's a very interesting large-scale transformation. And so the whole book is written in the context of trying to understand how this happened, why it happened, and what does it mean. So there are lots of people pontificating about what it means. And
Can I just ask about that? Is that shares of total food expenditure? Is that a similar if you look at meals?
okay, I can really get into the weeds with this about you, which I can. What's really actually super fascinating is if you break it down to the little whole foods like rice and carrots and those kinds of things, the USDA has done research, it's like 11%, right? And then the stuff above it is stuff that's already been processed in some way, shape, or form. And then it's things that have been purchased outside of the home and brought in, and then it's the things that you eat outside of the home. So, in fact, from the sort of going to the grocery store and only shopping at the perimeter, right? Because now you're not supposed to shop in the middle because that's where all the processed food is. That's a very small percentage of what people are spending their money on right now. Yeah.
I'm just curious, if you go on to 216, do the lines cross?
They're about to cross. Well, it depends on if you believe that the trend line with the, right? Well, remember too that part of what I'm saying is just the fact that that's happening doesn't mean cooking is in decline. It just means it's happening in different ways. But it's definitely something's happening where basically women are no longer obligated to make food for families. The domestic obligation of cooking has been delinked from gender, and it's all out there now. It's all out there. And we've also had this concomitant rise in the availability of food outside of the home in terms of the rise of institutions. Because the other thing that's happening in this period too is a assisted living, food prepared in hospitals. I mean, there's all these ways in which we also create all these other public environments in which we live or work every day where food is being prepared for us. And the other way that you can think about this too is if you think of 3 meals a day, in any given week, do you ever eat 21 meals in your home, all 21 meals in your home, right? Because of the way we live too, right? So we're going out for lunch with our friends, or we're, buying breakfast at the coffee shop on our way to work, or, so a lot of other things are shifting too. So, okay, so this is what got me into the project. And also, people saying things can get you into things. Now, there's a lot of ways I really like the work that people like Mark Bittman and Michael Pollan have been doing. And I think that they're really trying to create a cultural conversation about our relationship to food and trying to, in a sense, get us to become thoughtful about it in ways that we maybe haven't. But sometimes I find there is this kind of interesting cause and effect thing going on where there's the idea of here's the problem and here's the solution, and sometimes I don't agree. So I'm just going to, and like I said, I just want to say, I really like a lot of the work Michael Pollan has done, but in his book Cooked, he said, the decline of home cooking closely tracks the rise in obesity and all the chronic diseases linked to diet, which he followed immediately with this commentary: the rise of fast food and the decline in home cooking have also undermined the institution of the shared meal by encouraging us to eat different things and to eat them on the run and often alone. So cooking is our problem and cooking is our solution, theoretically, according to this. But I feel like there's a lot that's missing there, which is a lot that came out in the work that I did, which was ethnographic research, which I will tell you a little bit about. So I want to read you another quotation. This is Peg Bracken. I don't know if any of you remember Peg Bracken, but she wrote the I Hate to Cook book in the 1950s. And she was actually like an early professional woman and a journalist. And she wrote this book. The 50s is when you start to see things are starting to kind of get complicated about this assumption about women and cooking, and then it starts to really pull apart by the 60s and 70s. She said, "Some women, it is said, like to cook. This book is not for them. This book is for those of us who hate to, who have learned through hard experience that some activities become no less powerful through repetition: childbearing, paying taxes, cooking." So I would like to have Peg and Michael kind of duke it out a little bit on, the whole cooking thing, and like, is this really, the problem, solution, problem? So I think this was a lot of what I wanted to try to figure out is we over-idealize what cooking is. We also over-assume that it's somehow easy to do or pleasant to do or whatever. It's actually oftentimes a pain in the ass and unpleasant. And also, how many of you have ever made a meal and the people you made it for didn't appreciate it? Who likes that? Right? Anyway, I could talk a lot about this. As I told you, I'm like, I say I'm not going to talk, and then I'm like going on and on. But anyway, I did the research in a number of different ways. So one thing was I got really interested in thinking about this change over time. Like, okay, what happened? How did it happen? And there's a lot of different ways that I get at this in the book. So one thing I do is I look at the 7 editions of The Joy of Cooking, which is the iconic American national cookbook that has sold over 13 million copies, has been continuously in print since 1931. Really interesting book, started by Irma Rombauer, taken over by her very earnest daughter, Marion Rombauer Becker. It's really, really interesting, and I do this in the book. You can tell when Irma's writing, because she's like fun and breezy. And then Marion, who was like very involved in like the nutritional whole food movements of the 60s and 70s, and she went to a kind of Dewey-inspired, she taught at a Dewey-inspired school called the Barrow School. She's much more like, these are the ways we need to cook to do the right thing. And so you can see as the editions go on, you're like, oh, Irma is kind of getting pushed out, and we get a lot more Marion. And then at the end, actually, the grandson gets involved, and that is a whole other story. But I did that. I also looked at historical labor statistics, because one of the really interesting things that you find when you look at what happens in this trend is, although you could say, okay, what's happening here is cooking is in decline because all these people are not cooking at home because they're all being lazy and they're going out to eat. But when you look at the historical labor statistics, there's this other really interesting thing that happens, which is you have, beginning in, especially in 1970, you have this huge increase in people employed as paid cooks, but you have a subsequent and completely equivalent decline in domestic servants. So one of the things that I think is also sort of hidden in the story about what's happened to cooking in the United States is that if you ever had any money, you've had somebody else do the cooking on your behalf. And in fact, this could be a story of the great democratization of the Peg Bracken winning and saying, who wants to cook? Let's have somebody else cook. Let's pay them to cook, and then we don't have to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So these are some of the ways in which I just think there's some really interesting ways to think about this. So the other thing that I did with grad students is we did a series of interviews, and we also went into people's homes and talked to them about their experiences of cooking, and we also videotaped them cooking. And we used the interviews and the videos to develop a kind of emergent understanding of what is the level of cooking skill and knowledge of American home cooks and how does it work. And basically, just to sum it up really quickly, we are episodic cooks. We know how to cook, but we just don't cook all the time because we don't have to. So the cooking knowledge is not necessarily in decline, but it is, in a sense, being sort of realized in a very different way. And we also cook, what we sort of decided, and in the way that I organized the book, is that we cook across categories. So cooking is a chore, cooking is an occupation, cooking is an art, cooking is a craft, and cooking is for health. And what you see is people move between the categories. Either in a family, you might have the cooking is an art person who uses all the dishes and cooks one really amazing dish every few weeks. And then you have the cooking is a chore person who's like, well, I guess I'm the one who's just getting the food on the table every night, that kind of thing. And then we also have the, hey, let's just have somebody else do it for us tonight. Let's go to the Taste of India and get takeout. I've been very struck, I was talking about this at another event. I've been really struck about, if you look at the co-op, which is the place where people of a certain type of background in our community primarily go to shop, they invested in a huge renovation, and what percentage of that renovation is on food that's already prepared or processed in some way, right? It's almost all the prepared foods. I was really struck by that. And then there is all the meat, huge amount of meat, but a lot of it is already processed and prepared in some way too. So they didn't create a butcher counter, and they don't have whole sides of anything. And then it's the prepared foods. And I was talking to somebody at the co-op, and the other really interesting thing about that is she said it's the college students. She said that the college students are eating a lot of food there, and that's been a big change in the last, I know, it's very interesting. But anyway,
It's shaking my head, as you know, the food at Middlebury College is so good.
yeah,
And the faculty and staff are like salivating over the food.
right. Well, but they don't have,
Join them for a meal.
but they don't have a sense of autonomy, right? So that, you're exercising your autonomy, and now a place like a co-op is a kind of a cool and hip place to go to eat food, I think. But anyway, I also think that a lot of people are going there to get their lunches. I think a lot of people, notice that. People go there a lot to buy their lunch. So anyway, that's interesting. So this sort of episodic cooking, the sense that you're not really obliged to do it, that it's a chore, but it's a chore that you can kind of get yourself around, you can do workarounds. I think those are a lot of the things that we found.
Something is bubbled up in my mind when you mentioned the co-op. Have you divided up the research according to socioeconomic? So that, because we're just talking about the
Right.
spendable income.
So the way that we did the research, because so little had been done, is we went for what are the shared practices? What are the ways in which we could say everyone is kind of falling into a way or a category of thinking and doing, but then within that you do see differentiation. But one of the things that in our subsequent research, we've been doing a lot of research in other parts, like we did work in urban Philadelphia, and one of the things that we really found is that if you talk to people about food and cooking, everybody wants to do the right thing. It's not about the aspiration. It's about the complexity and difficulty of making it happen, and that sort of goes across class and to a certain amount across race and ethnicity. I think rural-urban is also a kind of an interesting distinction, but we worked really hard. We have people from rural parts of Vermont, from more urban parts of Vermont, from Boston, and from Philadelphia. So we tried to do sort of the Northeast and in different contexts. And we have a pretty good, we sort of represent, from the point of view of race and ethnicity, the region, which is primarily white, but we have people from different backgrounds. We have some immigrants, and we had people from low economic status to high economic status. Yeah, so different things. So I'll just read you the first. So a lot of what I did was I tried to provide I tried to do a lot of description of people talking about their cooking practice and then actual descriptions of what they did. Because we had the videos, we watched the videos, and I watched the videos over and over and over again to get a sense of what was happening. And it was actually one of the most unexpected and richest research experiences I ever had, because it was like being able to reread a novel or something, because I could watch and then I could stop and I could see what somebody's doing, and then I could say, what is happening here? I want to make sense of that. And a lot of that's in the book, and I'll show you a short clip from the same woman who I'm going to read from you, so you can get a sense of sort of how multi-layered and rich it is when you talk to people about cooking, but then you also have them do it, and you get to watch them do it. There's just a lot of things you can pick up. And I didn't realize what that was going to be until we did it. We have about 50 hours of video of people cooking. And then the other thing that we started to do was, when I was doing the project, especially when I first started the project, I used to teach at a culinary school, and I have a culinary background, and then I was running a nonprofit that was involved in the culinary world. And so when I was watching the videos, I realized that I was being very chefy, and I was really hyper-focusing on elements of what was happening that were the kinds of things that when you teach culinary professionals, you have a very particular disciplined way of teaching them. So we ended up bringing all these other people in to watch the videos, so that we would simultaneously watch the same video, and then everybody would say what they saw, so that we could realize that depending upon your perspective, you'd actually literally see the cooking differently. And that was really, really fun. I really enjoyed that. Okay, so I'm going to read this, and then I'll show you the video, just so you get a sense of it, and then I think we could just chat. Okay, so this is the beginning of the book. Claire, a middle-aged professional, is cooking dinner on a Friday night. She lives in an apartment near downtown Boston that has a large, recently renovated kitchen with loads of wood cabinets and long granite countertops. She is preparing, as she puts it, just soup and salad. This is a soup she makes often: butternut, squash, and apple, and the salad, a mix of arugula, spinach, and sliced endive, is also a mealtime regular. The recipe for this soup is written on an index card that has "From the Kitchen of" printed at the top and a drawing of a bright yellow teapot in the left-hand corner. To find it, she pulls out a manila recipe folder full of recipe cards, recipes cut from newspaper articles, and more torn from magazines. This collection, she says, has been at least 30 years in the making. She has all her ingredients set out on the kitchen table, along with the cutting board and knife. The soup pot and sauté pan sit on top of the stove. At first glance, this does not appear to be a remarkable scene. However, certain details about the recipe, the choice of ingredients, and the stories Claire tells to explain her meal selection make this seemingly typical American meal worth a closer look. The recipe for the butternut apple soup comes not from her mother, who then I say, quote, she says, "I would no sooner cook with my mother than jump off a bridge," but from a friend who first ate the soup at a popular cafe on Martha's Vineyard. Her friend was able to get the signature recipe, and she passed it on to Claire. To make the soup, she uses pre-cut butternut squash. I'm cheating with the squash. You see a lot of time-saving cut-up fruits and vegetables, but I think a lot of nutritional value is lost. She pauses, and then she concludes, "It's better than nothing." Ensuring that the soup gets made at home also involves buying a carton of vegetable broth, since, as Claire points out, you can get this kind of soup at Whole Foods now, so sometimes it doesn't seem worth it to cook it, but there's something a little more satisfying about making it at home. And Claire has only recently started cooking regularly at home again. She explains that she didn't cook for years, literally years. "I suppose I ate a few things that came out of my kitchen, but I had an expense account and I was on the road and eating in restaurants." So all is not what it seems. Claire's reflection on this single dinner revealed that making a meal is no obvious endeavor, either in the moment or including it in the broader context. So, yeah, I love that. I love that story. There's somebody said to me, "How could you begin a book about cooking with a quotation like that about their mother?" And I was like, well, I think that's reasonable. I don't think, but again, I think it's all that, the thing about the fantasies that we have versus sort of the way we actually live, the realities of it. All right, so I'll just show you her at work, just so you could see. I just have to get out of this. No, I'm sorry, I want this. Yeah. Okay, so this is, how do I make it bigger? Can I make it bigger? Can you guys sort of see it? It's not going to have sound. I just want you to see, this is the video. So literally, this is how I'm getting, I have interviews with her, but I also have this video. So this is how I'm able to make those descriptions. So, and they're also, you're chatting while you're doing it, right? So there's lots of things that are going on. Okay, right, so there's the double working, right? She's already, right? So she didn't like the size of it because she's trying to do it. Yeah. So another thing for me that's really fascinating, and this is like, again, this is partly because of my background. It's very interesting to me that the cutting board is almost going off the table. It's like a little, every time I watch it, I get a kind of stressed, and I'm like, whoa, put the cutting board back. And then the other thing is that she's actually at a table, so she's actually, she's not in a great place. Like she's not, but this is, I would get into these really long discussions with grad students about this. They're like, you can't impose that on her. And I'm like, I know, I'm just telling you it's bothering me. But so you have to have this whole kind of a conversation with yourself as you're analyzing it. The other thing that happens here is, this is also something that's really fascinating for me, but also that you probably don't even realize that you're doing when you're cooking, which is there's a lot of ways in which cooking, because we don't, I think partly because we're more episodic at it, and we now tend to squish the amount of time we spend in cooking to a very small period. There's a lot of like moving around that happens that, again, when you watch it, seems incredibly inefficient, right? I mean, one thing is she's got things here, but they're sort of moving around and rolling around, and then she got that, so she saved the time, but then they're too big, so now she's cutting them. But then there's always the like, oh, I forgot this. So then they go off screen because they've gone over to the refrigerator. And the other thing that's really fascinating is we really valorize kitchen spaces now, so we've made them bigger and bigger. So like I have some videos where, you know, somebody is here and then they realize they forgot something in their refrigerator, and then, you know, you're walking all the way over here. And then you have to get it, and then you have to carry it, and then you have to bring it back, and then you're like, oh my God, I forgot this thing too. So just watching the movement of people in their spaces is also really fascinating. So anyway, yeah, I think then I'll just stop for that for now, and I just, you know, there's lots of different things I could say, but there's basically 5 chapters, and each chapter has a theme, and each chapter uses descriptions of people cooking, but then goes into all this historical and cultural information too.
Would you comment on the influence of what I perceive to be this consciousness and value of food, and in particular the so-called organic aspect?
Amy, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question was, could I comment on the idea that people have about, you said the organic food and the values towards food?
Well, the consciousness I pick up, maybe because I've got 5 grandchildren, and I'm getting feedback from them and their perception of food is different. And what food you should eat and what food you shouldn't eat.
Right. I do think that there is a very interesting consequence of this shift, in the sense that I think that the primary identity that most Americans have around food is as eaters and not as cooks. And so there's a lot of attention being spent on this idea of what am I going to put into my body, or what am I going to put into my precious children's bodies, right? Because they are primarily eaters, and in a sense, many people's relationship to food is primarily eating, right? And so I think that every decade that has gone by in the United States since, let's say, the 1800s or 1900, you have less and less, fewer and fewer requirements that you have to know that much about the food that you put into your body, because it's available to you all the time in so many different ways. So as we have more access and more ability to be eaters of anything all the time, we seem to be getting more and more worried about it. So there's this whole anxiety about the food that we eat, because in a sense, in a way, we become more distant from it. That's what I would say. And so we worry about it all and what it means and what it's doing to us. And then it's now become also a big part of people's understanding of the environment. And so what is the environment, which, you know, what are we doing to the environment, but in what environments is our food being prepared? But I will say one thing that I do find really interesting is that people can be that concerned about things like things being organic, but they'll go to a restaurant and they will never, ever think that they might want to know what's happening in those kitchens. And if you've worked in restaurants, it's kind of an interesting choice.
I heard recently somebody say, I think it was the physical therapist, that because of the high rate of obesity and maybe food-related illnesses, we should look at food as medicine, you know, so take it consciously and in a way, very aware of how it will affect our system. Is that something that, you know, you have looked at, or, you know, what just say?
Does- So she was asking that should we think about food more as a type of medicine rather than like as a type of nourishment or nurturance? I mean, that would be really sad to me, you know, just because I love food and cooking, and I just, you know, I work in a nutrition department, and I have a lot of students who are primarily just so focused on every little tiny thing about the food in relationship to a concept of health. And I mean, I think we have to understand the consequences of the choices we make, of the foods that we eat. But I worry a little bit about it getting so hyper individualized and attenuated that we don't really understand food as this for its social qualities or celebratory qualities or whatever. I think about that. So.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about the rise of these companies like Blue Apron.
Oh, yes.
Not that I'm scrutinizing your laptop.
Yeah.
The folder on it that says Blue Apron.
Yes. Yes, I did a whole project. Oh, yes.
Actually, just to add to that, as I was driving here, and apologies for being late, that I was negotiating my way on a slippery road, but I got to hear more of, what is it called, Marketplace, and they were talking about how Blue Apron was getting in the way of CSAs being successful, and so there's this really strong.
And I think, like, I heard about the Blue Apron idea, I'm like, who would do that? Like, it's,
Community supported
like, it makes no
agriculture.
sense to me personally.
I don't know.
From the perspective of someone who actually enjoys cooking and wants, you know, whatever.
Well, people enjoy cooking who use blue. Yeah. Okay, so very interesting, and Angela knows about this, that I got very obsessed towards the end of writing this book. I got obsessed by meal delivery service because I was like, what is going on? This is really interesting. And I did a little project with a senior at UVM who was doing her honors college thesis, and we did a little project where we gave people a week of Blue Apron, and we sort of observed and studied them. And then she did a survey of people who had used meal delivery services and tried to find out like what was going on. So it's completely fascinating. And I will tell you that I think it's the future. I really do. I think there is something really, really fascinating and important about what's happening. And a big thing that's different about the CSA is it's actually teaching you while it's giving you the product. So, and it's teaching you, but it's helping you as you go along. Because one of the great CSA problems is that there's this kind of weird black box thing that you're gonna pick it up and then, oh, great, 5 pounds of kohlrabi, I'm psyched, and I'm gonna go home and I'm gonna make my kohlrabi, and it's like it has a whole labor assumption behind it, that you're gonna have the time and the interest, and you're not gonna be Peg Bracken, and you're gonna be the noble, virtuous CSA person, and you're gonna do that. But it's not, they're finding people don't really do that, and people find the sort of the challenge of CSAs too challenging. And what Blue Apron does in these other places is they give it to you all already done. So you get everything that you need for the meals. And so we did it at our house. And it was so funny because I have a culinary background and so does my husband. So for us, like making meals is not actually like very stressful in that way, but we oftentimes run out of time. And I was away and I came home today and I'm like, oh, it looks like takeout from Taste of India happened, and it isn't like my husband doesn't have the skills, but it was like, oh, I'm tired or it's busy, blah, 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 blah. So he got the takeout, right? So he was like really dismissive, like, why would we need Blue Apron? But there were certain things about it, like you feel kind of taken care of because they've done work for you. Yeah, because it's like you've had a prep cook has prepped the food for you, right? Because things are already kind of parceled. So like for me, my favorite thing, I was going on and on to my friends about this. They have this thing called knickknacks. And the knickknacks are, they all of the spices and all of the condiments and things, they've actually portioned out just for what you need for the recipe. And I had not realized how much I hate rustling through my spice cabinet to get my spices out. Like, I resent it. I'm like, where is the cinnamon? I can't find it. And then this, it was like right there, and I was like, pfft, open it up and then pour it in. And
We might have different factions.
I know. I mean, I'm just saying, if you feel like you need to feel like you always love cooking, I'm like, good for you, you know, that's great, but I just feel like the average American doesn't always feel that way. And then I have my editor of my book who had a baby, and I was like, I was telling her all about the Blue Apron and the project, and she's like, oh, this is so interesting. I said, okay, so I gave her a Blue Apron week for a celebration of having the baby, so she just emailed me, she's like, Amy, I have so many things to tell you about. I have so much to talk to you about. And her big thing, and I thought this was really, really fascinating, is her husband does not really know how to cook, or he's not confident. This is the other thing I want you to know, that one of the big things that's really important, I think, in this whole story is who feels confident and who feels required to cook. Like, confidence is actually a huge issue. So her husband just was like, I don't know how to do this, and you're so good at it, and blah, blah, blah. But then, of course, I had a baby, and they both work. So I saw her, and she's like, you know, my biggest anxiety since having the baby has been, what if something happens to me, and the baby will starve because Jonathan will not be able to cook for the baby? And I was like, it was kind of a new mother thing, but I was like, okay, maybe. But she wrote me, and she's like, it's so great because Jonathan has made the Blue Apron meals and he loves it, and because he watches the videos and he follows it. And then out of the blue, yeah, they have videos. You can go online and watch the video to support the dish.
So, Amy, I don't think I've ever told you this, but a friend of mine goes to Brooklyn to have Thanksgiving dinner every Thanksgiving, and everyone in the high-rise has little boxes of blue ribbon
Yeah.
outside their doors, the
Yeah.
whole building.
Yeah.
So apparently it is popular.
Like in urban areas, and it started with tech. And like in San Francisco and Oakland, it's like you go out and there's just full of these boxes. Like it's doing really well in certain sectors. There is an issue of recidivism, which is a CSA problem too, you know, which is people get into it and they're really into it for a while and then they stop. And so one of the things that they're trying to figure out at places like these companies is what makes people keep doing it for a longer period of time and what makes people do it and then they stop. And the big thing when we did the research, and again, these are the kinds of things that you probably haven't spent as much time thinking about this as I have because you haven't been interviewing people, but okay, the big thing that the Blue Apron, people that we talked to who did it, who had never done it before, they have a calculus in their mind. So their calculus is the stuff that I make that I love to make, and then takeout. So that's their kind of calculus of like the way that they work. So Blue Apron, the problem was for some people, for Blue Apron and these meal delivery services is they're chefy, so they make you use a lot of dishes. So people would say to me, well, if I'm going to spend the money and I'm not going to just make what I usually make, then I might as well get takeout because then I have more choice and I don't have any dishes. And you know, again, you don't really think about it, but in fact, people make a lot of choices because they don't want to A, plan, B, shop, and C, do dishes. The cooking part of it is oftentimes not the barrier. It's these other things that are actually the barrier.
So, I'm going to ask a question that's too simple, but you know how I'm thinking a lot about time and spaciousness in my work. What do you think is the popularity of Blue Apron, the resistance to cooking, all these factors, how much of it has to do with the busyness factor in our lives versus other factors that you've looked at? Or is that too simple a question when you're doing ethnographic research? Let's say this, somebody who's done ethnographic research, I know it's not that simple to separate out this.
Yeah. I mean, It's probably the number one, when people talk to you about their relationship to cooking and particularly why they don't do it, the number one reason they'll say is what's called time poverty. Yeah. Time poverty is a really big aspect of how people explain why they don't meet their own aspirations. But it's also the case with fitness, right? These are the, as a culture, time poverty just is sort of it's a culturally acceptable way to say that you are failing to fulfill your own obligations to yourself and to others, So it is not, and it's complicated for me because the other thing is that part of the reason why we have a perception of time poverty is because we as women no longer have to feel as if our time needs to be spent doing this. So it's why I will take anybody's time poverty argument seriously, and I'll be like, yeah, because you also want to be on the select board and have a job and hang out with your friends and not feel like you're just stuck in your house with nothing else that you can do. I mean, those are all really positive reasons why you have a perception of time poverty. But the acts of cooking have not become longer, or they're much easier in a lot of ways. So I guess that's the trade-off.
Yeah, but then you stuck email in there.
Oh, you mean what else we do with our time?
Yeah, and sometimes, from time on.
One of the other things that I'm very fascinated by is, because I'm sure we all know that we can even see in the last 10 years the way in which it's culturally acceptable to walk around with your phone in front of you, and that would have not been culturally, how quickly we will change our cultural mores without even realizing we're changing them. So one of the things, I was talking to this colleague of mine about the project at some point, and he was from Costa Rica, and I was saying, Americans have this idea of time poverty, and a lot of this is related to this notion that cooking is what should happen from the moment you walk in the door after the end of the day to when you sit down to eat, which is why there's so much emphasis on 30 minutes or less or quick and easy. And he's like, oh, so you mean when you get up in the morning, you don't talk about how you need to soak the black beans before you leave the house and then, also like pull the this and the that from the freezer? And I'm like, no, that's not happening. He's like, well, then how are you going to get your meal done in time if you don't start cooking in the morning, right? So this is another thing that we've changed our whole relationship with how we relate to what we do at different times in the day, because we've allowed ourselves to think that it's the only something that we do after we're done with the bulk of our day. So for example, those of you who, I'm a commuter, but I also work from home. So what's really interesting is I cook on the days that I work from home, because I have all these little moments where I can start something and then do something else. But if you're not in your house, and then now there's like the slow cooker, but now there's a new thing. Everybody's been telling me the hot new thing. The what?
Like an all-in-one pressure cooker.
Yes. What's it called? Instapot. People are saying that's going to be the new solution. Blue Apron and Instapots are going to make us all, because you can cook it really quickly. You still have to plan, though, and I will say that what the meal delivery services do is you don't have to plan yourself. You just have to click, and then it comes to your door, and all of the planning and all the prepping's been done. And that's why I think there might be something there.
The way I always hear it advertised also is that the kids get involved.
Yeah.
Because it's a family project.
So like I said, so my friend's husband is doing it because of the baby. But then we had these friends, we gave it to these friends of ours for a week, and their two kids got really interested. And so they were in high school, and the older kid said, well, we're going to make one of these. So they did one of the meals, and it was a sauteed chicken breast, and they had never done it. And so they were like, it said on the recipe, if you want more information, go online. So then he was like, oh, let's go watch the video. So he and his sister watched the video of how to saute the chicken breast, and then they sauteed the chicken breast. And so there is some, that's where I think the interesting thing for someone like me who's interested in learning to cook, I'm like, is this the way people are going to learn how to cook? So.
I'm wondering about how much advertisement has driven our perception that cooking should be fast. When I came to the United States for the first time in 1970, and opening a can of whatever, SpaghettiOs or something, and having fish sticks on the side, that was kind of the ideal of cooking and fast.
Yeah.
And I think we have really gotten away from that, which is wonderful. But has it been left in our perception that cooking should be just easy, quick, and
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I feel like there's always been this tension. There's a tension in our, I just think once you liberate somebody from the obligation of the labor, there's going to be ambivalence, and there's going to be like, is there a way that I don't have to do this? And when you're interested in cooking as a cultural practice, it's really complicated. Like, for example, in Mexico right now, making tortillas, like homemade tortillas are wonderful. But, they've calculated that the average Mexican woman historically spent 4 hours a day making tortillas, right? That's very labor-intensive work. And now you can buy them, prepared, I'm torn because I study cultural traditions. I don't really want us to only have industrial tortillas, but I don't want to tell women that they should go back to spending 4 hours a day making their tortillas. Or maybe they should. I mean, it's just like farming. Like, we want everybody to be a peasant farmer, but do we want to be the peasant farmer? Not really, So a lot of food gets at some of the ways in which modern life, in order to live the modern lives we want to live, we actually have to let go of some of the ideas we have about what makes life good or meaningful, or we have to create new meaning in it, So I don't know.
Part of it too is the kids I work with, some of them are so used to prepackaged food, which is all they eat is stuff that comes in as neon colored, that they are accustomed to that flavor that's been very carefully calibrated to get them. And when I serve them real food that I've carefully made at home or teach them to cook and have them eat it, it doesn't feel right to them in their mouth. It's foreign, it's like just not. So their whole concept of eating is that it should taste this certain way, and they don't like it if it doesn't have that chemical
Bad for them, they'll grow up someday.
Well, don't you,
They're being raised by people who eat that way.
but don't you feel like too there's a very clear, biological change that happens eating so much processed food? Sugar isn't just something that people enjoy eating. There's very clear correlations between children who eat so much processed food. Eventually it's their bodies telling them, this is exactly what you need. You need these fats and you need this sugar. So eating something that isn't so highly processed and isn't full of those ingredients is their body and their taste buds saying, this isn't what is going to feed you. I think there's a very clear push that is beyond their control.
Well, and I think this is to me, these are the questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves in the context of understanding the consequence of what we say when we say these kinds of foods are making certain kind of people only want processed food, because who's going to do the labor to make these other types of food? And I think that's a cultural dilemma that we have. So, and that's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in meal delivery service. I'm like, why not have meal delivery service be part of SNAP? So that if you're on SNAP, you get the meals, everything portioned out for you already of the whole ingredients, and then you make that food, but you have a simple recipe, but you haven't had to plan, you haven't had to shop, and I think that these are some of the questions we have to figure out for ourselves. One of the reasons I was saying that I both like what Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman are doing, but I also am very concerned is I think they're creating this kind of demonized situation where they're saying, here's all these, quote, bad foods, which is something in our culture we love to do the bad food, good food thing. It's like endless, and we love moral virtue. We love the moral virtue approach. But, eating is, and making food, it's all just really kind of a schleppy thing, And so if we get ourselves too down some idea that there's a morally right way and a morally wrong way to do it, I think we're just setting ourselves up for more failure. I mean, we haven't really succeeded at almost any intervention we've done around food and cooking for, ever since we've tried. So, and I think that what you two bring up is one of the things that I'm really, really interested in going forward, which is, right, so I think about the Mexican woman who makes the tortillas and makes the salsas by hand, and her peasant husband has grown all those products, and they are spending the significant amount of the hours of their day doing that work. And then we see the people that are buying this processed food because it's easy, it's cheap, and it's convenient. And then we can't position these things against each other because we're never going to get out, is what I think. And so I'm like, what's the middle ground? Like, is it Blue Apron? I don't know. Blue Apron for the masses. Maybe that's what I should do.
I think it's interesting to recognize what's happening with the and then ask, can we get rid of soda pop?
Right. There's certainly a lot of people who feel that if you could just remove a certain access to sugar, you could change a lot very quickly. If you could demonize sugar the way they demonized tobacco. But they're having trouble, You can't create, it's much more difficult with food than it is with tobacco to create cause and effect between the intake and the health issue. And you can make this argument about obesity writ large, but it's really problematic. It's really problematic. It's much harder. And obesity is it can create certain chronic illnesses, but it is not necessarily creating a situation of mortality in an absolute sense. So it just,
Did you ever smoke?
a little bit, yeah. It's definitely,
No, I think it's pertinent in this question because what you're describing is not that different with respect to smoking. You have the same kind of desire as you do for French fries.
so are
I
you
know
saying,
French fries.
so you're saying that, so should we have like warning labels and that kind of thing?
Oh, I think the way it's going to
The taxing?
Where soda is going to go is taxing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a regressive tax though, right?
Oh, it has to be.
Yeah.
But just think of all the things we could improve in life if we could manage our taxes.
My sense, though, tell me if I'm right, since I haven't read your book yet, is that you're not trying to solve a problem so much as interpret culture and
Yeah.
look at all the vast range of meanings of food and cooking in this cultural moment that we're in. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think that I primarily want us to appreciate the labor and the practice, and to understand that it's both incredibly powerful and, for someone like me, completely worth spending hours and hours doing. But I don't think I can impose that on everybody because I think it has been imposed on basically women and minorities. Between domestic servants and home cooking, it's been put on people, and we're still doing it today. I mean, I just want to remind everybody that you may feel proud that you don't have a domestic servant, but there's somebody making not a lot of money in not great circumstances, making all that food for you at Whole Foods or at the co-op. Maybe at the co-op they have health benefits. They do. If you're working that hourly work in the deli.
It depends on,
Cumulative, but if you're full-time work.
if you're, but not part-time or so, which is also a large portion.
Right. Yeah.
So let me ask you, because I did not know about Blue Apron, so
I know, you're going to have to get it.
Well, I'm looking at it, if it really and then create a social space. Because for me, apart from feeding, a family, there's also that opportunity of having conversations and being together. And what you mentioned before that there were more people eating alone.
Well, that's what Michael Pollan says. That the cooking, no less home cooking means more isolation and more obesity.
And so, creating these social spaces where a lot happens, in a group, in a family, in social context, that actually makes me very hopeful, to
Yeah.
have a service
Yeah.
like that. Although initially I thought like, why would you want to have everything packaged? Then I can just, buy it already made and, and
Yeah.
go through the pretend process.
Well, that's how much I'm thinking about is if you're learning how to cook from a video, and then I have a question for you, but I suddenly thought again, because cooking and eating has so many layers of meaning, like on the one hand, if that gets your kids, say, to take interest in cooking and share that interest with siblings and friends, that seems like a really wonderful thing. Then the concerned person in me says, but wait, there were conversations I had with my mother when she was, cooking and I was helping her. But the conversation wasn't about cooking. It was all the other important conversations.
Yes.
And that I have, not with my kids because I don't have kids, but I still, it's in the context of cooking is often
Yeah.
important conversations
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
And that gets lost if you're learning from a video.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to judge it one way or the other.
I know,
but
right?
I just find it really interesting.
I know.
chaos Because it can enable something really wonderful, but something can be lost, but maybe that was going to be lost anyway.
I know.
About gender.
Yeah.
You said, well, okay, so these things have been decoupled. To what extent, say more about that, I guess, because I still think, just in my observations in the world that I live in, that cooking is still really gendered. And that women feel a set of feelings around cooking, whether they're actually cooking or not, that tend to be different than how men think about it. Did you get into that in your research?
I mean, it wasn't explicit. Yeah. So one thing that I think did come out of doing the research is how important where you are on your life course is in relationship to how much gender plays out in cooking. So if you are in a relationship and you have children, the idea of the aspirations of the kind of food you're supposed to make and who should do it, the mother role and the nurturing role and the making the meals is still highly vexed territory. I was very interested in the research how as people got older and the children grow up, then there's much more talk about equity in the cooking. And men often, but increasingly in domestic chores now, the domestic chore that men will take on with the least amount of grumbling is cooking, because there's more payoff. There's more possible payoff, right? Right, like cleaning the house and, doing the laundry. You don't really have a social payoff, but cooking has a social payoff. So there's some evidence that that's what's happening. But I think that the nurturance thing is where women are still kind of stuck in a way that men feel it much less intensely. That's sort of what I found, yeah. And I do want to say, and I know that I don't know how long we want to go because I know it's after 8, but I'm very torn because I love cooking, and cooking to me is an incredibly powerful way to make meaning in my own life and in the lives of the people, and to create meaning with other people and to pass on information intergenerationally. So there's this part of me that does think that there's a loss if we don't do it in our domestic spaces. But there's this part of me that feels that maybe we have to become imaginative in new ways. And so, for example, I teach at UVM, I have a foods lab and I teach young people how to cook. And it's unbelievably fun and gratifying. And I feel like, well, maybe that's where it should happen. Like, maybe we shouldn't expect, given the way that we live in the United States today, with people having to work outside of the home, with everyone needing to work, with, our declining incomes, and, we all know what our situation is. And our situation is, unless you reach a certain level where you have enough money that you can get a private in-home cook, pretty much from people who are impoverished to people who are middle class and upper middle class are still in a juggle struggle every day. It's still, there's a kind of a universality of that. And maybe we're going to have to do it in different ways. It's like one of the things I think is maybe we should have our faith communities be teaching about cooking. I mean, also, faith communities have great kitchens. And, a lot of times they're really empty, except for being charitable towards others. But actually, your community might need it too. Or like at UVM, and we are thinking more and more about just teaching classes for anybody at UVM, any student. Because if they don't learn, when are they going to learn? And if it isn't going to happen in the homes, and should we expect it to, then maybe we have to find other places where we do it.
On that comment, I used to work at a youth center in Burlington, King Street Youth Center, and I'd say easily the most popular activity was we did something called Kids Cafe, and we'd bring like maybe 4 or 5 of the kids into the kitchen, and we'd just cook a meal. And partly it was because they got to eat it.
Right.
But they just love to cook meals mostly middle school and early high school. And so I think there's definitely seemed like super interest and it was social and it was fun and they were really good. So.
My after-school kids love cooking above all other activities.
Is that right?
Yeah, I crushed a child today because I'd been sick all week. And she was expecting to cook on Thursday. I was like, I'm sorry.
I can't do it. I know.
How does that jive with what you were saying about that they're not used to eating?
Some of them aren't and some of them are, and there's a real big difference in the attitudes of the kids who obviously cook at home with their families and who are handed a cardboard box full of stuff to sit somewhere else and eat and not bother us. And it's thrilling for those kids to help cook.
Yeah.
Then they're not quite sure they want to eat it.
You're right.
They want to actually digest it, but the act of cooking together is very exciting.
I think
and
that's
it's so liberating to hand a young child a sharp knife and say, I'm not allowed to use this at home.
Yeah. I think liking is I think the point you're making is also, it's something that, again, like, I could talk about for a while, but I won't, but I've also done a lot of work on how you develop a sensory appreciation or a concept of quality in relationship to food, and developing liking is actually is also very complex and very culturally based, and it's very much based on repetition. So it is the case, I think you're absolutely right, that you don't know what you don't know. So if you've eaten a certain kind of food for most of your life, that's just what you think is good. And so there is work that has to be done if we're going to, I think that is really some of the consequence of processed foods. It's less for me about a decline of cooking as it is a notion of preference. And how do you change concepts of preference so that people don't, young people in particular, don't think that it's how do you get somebody away from a potato chip and towards a carrot, but also not shaming them for having the potato chip. So it's pretty complicated, but I do think that cooking is a kind of space where you can start to do that in a way that's much more creative and fun and interesting than just being like the person who says, you are being a bad person for eating that bad food. Like,
Well, lunches are healthy, and I just look at them and there's so little fat in them. Growing children need some fat in their lives, and there's no flavor, and the mouthfeel is just horrible. It's just like, so their concept of healthy food is going to be, if there are choices, cardboard food at home or this so-called healthy food at school, is the healthy food is gross. Someone went to a great deal of trouble to manufacture and engineer this delightful thing that my parents parents give me.
Right.
And what you give me at school tastes like garbage.
Yeah, right.
And
'cause-
I'm trying to show, no, here's something else you could do too.
Right, right. And you have to do it multiple times. And that's one of the things. We don't really create those kinds of environments where we say, nope, try it again. Nope, try it again. Nope. Okay.
In their school initiatives, there is one that ran in Bristol Elementary School, where the school was given a grant to offer fruit, exotic fruit, all kinds of fruit. Every day there was a different platter. And after the third, fourth round, the kids actually took, whatever
Right.
seemed undesirable before,
Yeah.
So that sense of.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we should finish. I know people have to leave. And yeah, thanks for coming, Lori. But one of the ironies I do want to say, to go back to the issue of gender and all of this, is that what the first woman faculty member at the University of Vermont was Bertha Terrell, and she was at the time, they only taught classics, right? This is 1909. She was the first female faculty member, and she was brought on to teach household management and home economics, because in those days, that's what you could teach. And then she founded the home economics department, and she was one of the really crucial people in bringing home economics education to high schools and elementary schools throughout Vermont, but also throughout New England. And then with the feminist movement and the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, there was just this complete denigration of home economics, because that was the sort of marginalization of women and the sort of not allowing women to do more meaningful or abstract or conceptual work. And so home economics just went down the tubes and was pulled out of primary and secondary education. They took home economics out of the title of the department, and they changed it to nutrition and foods. There's still it's still called the Bertha Terrell Home Economics Building at UVM, and I'm really literally the person who is still doing home economics, because I have the lab that still remains because of a certain element of the curriculum in our department. And I just think it's really funny that it's, that feminism and the first wave and second wave of feminism says we got to get rid of this, and now we're all going, oh, maybe we have to bring it back. And anyway, it's just sort of,
In Sweden, they've managed that without, they've decoupled from gender without losing how to cook.
What is that?
In Sweden, my Swedish
Oh.
kids cook all the time. The man cooks this night, the woman cooks that night,
Right.
the man cooks this night, and the kid cooks some other night.
And I would say, just in closing, that I think that in order for us to get there, we have to take the practice seriously, and we have to say it matters, and we have to say that we value it as a culture and as a form of labor, and then we have to build the case for that. And then I think we could create the conditions under which you might have more people cooking, and when people are cooking, they're fairly compensated for it, either from the love they get from the people in their family or from the paycheck that they get from the places that they work. So, thank you.